giant, and there are plans.
Right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide. And we're going to be talking today about how the media pathologizes freedom. I don't know if they're ready to quite call it a mental illness, but they're sure skirting up to where it's seen as an aberration, and you should be pretty careful of anybody who values their freedom more than the media does. Before we go that direction, though, there's a tweet I want to share with you that I thought really described the problem rather well. This person writes, the media has taught us to, number one, be concerned with things we cannot change. Number two, to ignore things we can. And number three, to be too overwhelmed by nonsense to know the difference. That's why we must do more to cancel sensationalists, televised punditry, and exaggerated ideological divides. Now, I know of nothing that better illustrates all of those factors than what has been happening with Ammon Bundy and St. Luke's. And I'm going to give you some very solid examples of what that media spin and sensationalization and accentuating divides looks like. But first, I want to give you some context, and I'm doing this in full disclosure. I have been friends with Ammon Bundy. I have personally known Ammon and his family for a very long time. I've known Ammon for at least the last 9 years. I've been friends with his brother Ryan for at least, almost 20 years. And so I'm speaking to you perhaps as someone who's been hopelessly compromised because of my association with them, or conversely, I'm maybe speaking to you as someone who has actually had the ability and taken the opportunity to go to the source rather than waiting for some blow-dried spinmeister to spoon-feed me what I'm supposed to believe about them. I think there's a difference in going to the source versus not going to the source. And I understand for some people, well, I don't have time to go sit down on Ammon's porch with him and ask him these questions. That's fine. He's actually been very active here lately in putting out some videos that I think very well explain his point of view. Now, you may still disagree, but if you are an intellectually honest person, and I can't imagine somebody lasting more than about 15 seconds in a program like this one, or at least watching a program like this one, if they didn't at least have some kind of intellectual honesty, I would encourage you, watch his videos and see if you don't find a little bit of the context that is missing from so much of the media coverage. So the problem with St. Luke's, I'm going to use some aid here from the peoplesrights.org. This is an organization that Ammon founded, People's Rights, and they're talking a little bit about what happened with the taking of baby Cyrus back in the early spring of 2022. St. Luke's hospital executives and staff participated in taking baby Cyrus from his parents, even though there was no evidence of abuse or neglect, which, by the way, is required by law before a child can legally be taken by the state. Well, why would they do something like this? It's because his parents missed a doctor's appointment. And doctors, because of certain laws, now can say, well, if you don't meet our criteria, if you don't use our services as we dictate you should, we can get Child Protective Services involved. That brought in the Department of Health and Welfare, which brought in law enforcement, which resulted in a medical kidnapping of a tiny child. St. Luke's doctor Natasha Erickson knew she had power to control Cyrus's parents and forced them to do as she wanted, even though she had misdiagnosed baby Cyrus. Well, what was wrong with him? He was transitioning from breast milk to solid foods. And like some babies, they struggle a little bit with that transition, meaning it would cause him to throw up whatever he had eaten. So breastfeeding was the best way to get him nutrition at that point as they were trying to work him through that transition. So the doctor wrongly treated that as, well, this is evidence that the kid's being neglected or he's being starved. And the parents, terrified by Dr. Erickson's threats to call CPS, did what she required them to do. In other words, they still took him to see the doctor, but she called CPS anyways. CPS, motivated to take children to justify their existence and to qualify for more federal funds, directed the Meridian Police Department to take baby Cyrus by force, detaining his father while arresting his mother and aunt. Now, if you haven't seen the video of this footage, it's worth your time. Not only to see the absolute soullessness of these individuals on the police force that they didn't care. I mean, they were acting as heel clickers and enforcers rather than as peace officers, and the only thing they were determined to do was by hook or crook or by deceit, which they used to coercively take that baby from his mother. Moving on. That night, St. Luke's ER doctor, Rachel Thomas, reported to the Meridian police officers that baby Cyrus took the bottle just fine and is sleeping. And she did so with a kind of smugness on her face. Now, the writer here says, I'm sure all involved thought they were justified in taking the baby and that they could take better care of him than his parents. Now, it's important that you understand this, because the protests that came as a result of this did not just materialize out of thin air. They came from the wrongful taking of a baby that was not in danger, that was not in distress, and not in a state of medical emergency. But the state can never admit that it's wrong. And businesses like St. Luke's that have partnered with the state in this regard can never admit that they were wrong either. I mean, why would you? If you can force somebody to do business with you, with the power of the state backing you up, that's a pretty sweet arrangement. So they thought they were justified in taking him. And this is the thinking of institutionalized people that's very dangerous for all parents, not just parents who happen to know and love their rights. A few hours later, Cyrus did what he always does when he was fed anything but mother's milk. He threw it all up. But this time his mother wasn't there to bathe him, to change his clothing, and to change his bedding. In fact, here is the actual report that was filed by the nurse. The RN entered the room at approximately 02:45 to start the next NG feed. They actually had put a nasal gastric tube in him because he had been throwing up, and found patient asleep with a large amount of emesis, that's vomit, on patient and blanket. Oh, so he was laying there in his vomit in order to continue with next bolus feed, that's through the tube, and call if patient has another emesis. All right then. I mean, would his mother have paid a little closer attention? I would like to believe so. Also, Cyrus was injected with several IVs, or the staff tried to get an IV started in multiple times. He had several injection bruises over his body. Knowing that it would be unhealthy for him to survive on an IV alone, this is why St. Luke's staff inserted a nasal feeding tube down Cyrus's throat. All of these tubes and needles were to compensate for breastfeeding. Now, this could have been easily averted had they just allowed his mother to visit, feed him, or see him, but they did not. Why? Because they had started the abused child or neglected child narrative, and this is how the system responds. Checking off boxes. There's very little thought, there's very little humanity involved in this. Now, baby Cyrus did not die in St. Luke's care, thank goodness, but only a few days in, and he was becoming lethargic. Finally, a decent ISP officer advocated for the family and got the mother in to visit and feed him. So let's talk about the protests that were taking place. During this time, after an intense political battle in front of St. Luke's Boise Hospital and over the Ethernet, baby Cyrus was given back to his parents. Now, typically, this is something that will take at least 2 to 3 months before a child is given back, if ever. They actually had a foster family all lined up actually that night that he was taken. The institutions responsible for taking Cyrus were concerned about the buildup of public outrage over their action, and they released him within 7 days. Now, ultimately, the political pressure worked. But this is where St. Luke's was scorned, their reputation tattered. In the past, when anyone would speak bad about St. Luke's, attorneys would send them a cease and desist letter and threaten a lawsuit to shut them up. But with the baby's grandfather, Diego Rodriguez, and Ammon Bundy, St. Luke's executives found that they could not be intimidated. So that's why the protests began. And it's interesting. In Ammon's latest video, he did an interview with, I assume it was Morgan Romero from KTVB, but he says, I'm anxious to see how she spins this, because he said she was just incredulous. He asked her, what exactly have I done wrong? First thing she came up, well, it was the protests, as if they just materialized out of nothing, just for no reason. He had an axe to grind, and he just wanted to draw attention to himself and grift off of people. And no, it's because St. Luke's collaborated with the Department of Health and Welfare and one of their doctors and with the police to take a baby from his family when it was not medically necessary. I think this was probably a hard thing for people who are indoctrinated to believe the state can never be wrong to understand. Sometimes the state is wrong. Sometimes it's terribly wrong. But they seem to see the greater crime in standing up and pointing out that wrong. So here's Idaho Press reporting with a little help from KTVB reporter Tracy Bringhurst. St. Luke's withdraws Supreme Court petition in Bundy case. Okay, so St. Luke's had Ammon arrested and charged with trespassing. That happened the first night. But the protests continued for several days until St. Luke's and the various authorities involved relented and gave baby Cyrus back to his family. Now, they wouldn't have done that if he was seriously in a case of medical danger, but the political pressure was too much. After Ammon had gone ahead and pleaded guilty to the trespass charge. That was the only criminal charge that he faced. But St. Luke's decided to pursue. They unleashed their lawyers on him to crush him in a civil suit. And so Ammon, in his video, explains the reason I didn't respond to the civil suit is because I knew that if I don't respond, what they're going to do, according to, I think it's Article 55 in the Supreme Court's the Idaho State Supreme Court's procedural rules, is then the judge will just enter a default judgment for the plaintiff and basically assign whatever the penalty is going to be. St. Luke's is not happy with that, though. They want to see him in jail. They want him punished. They want the Gem County Sheriff to agree to serve papers. The sheriff, by the way, talked with Ammon just a few days ago, and Ammon told him after confronting deputies who not only came on his property to serve him papers, but were actively snooping around his property, walking into buildings, knocking on windows, violating his Fourth Amendment right against illegal search. So when Ammon confronted them, yes, he was very angry. Now, when we say confronted, well, he was pointing guns at him. The news media would like you to believe that. Well, they were concerned for the deputy's safety. Trust me, the deputies were the only ones who were packing heat in that situation. But Ammon was rightly angry and ordered them off his property. As he says, I don't think I've ever been more upset in my life. He talked with the sheriff, and the sheriff said, I don't want to see somebody get hurt over this. I'm concerned for the process servers. I'm concerned for my deputies, but I don't want to see anybody get hurt. That could include Ammon and his family as well. Now let's look at how the media spins this, because the spin on this is just epic. St. Luke's withdraws Supreme Court petition, which was to force the sheriff to agree to serve papers. By the way, the sheriff did buckle under. Okay, I'll do it. That's a shame. Look at the way that they put this, though. The Gem County Sheriff issued a press release agreeing to serve Ammon with legal papers after lawyers for St. Luke's filed a writ of mandamus with the Idaho Supreme Court on April 17th. The sheriff's office had previously said that Bundy had become increasingly aggressive. That's not his exact words, but that he was definitely very frustrated. He told the sheriff, I'm at the breaking point. And the sheriff said, you know what, from the tone of his voice, I think so. Now, in one of his videos, Ammon shows just one example. In one day, the amount of legal papers that were being served to him. And I think he pulled no less than 8 different sheafs of paper. There were reams of paper that were all the product of these lawyers. You hand lawyers a blank check and say, go destroy that person. They have a lot of tools at their disposal. Part of it is burying people in paperwork. And of course, you have to respond. And this is going to cost you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to do so. And so the sheriff's office had said they wanted to opt out of the duty. Now, this leaves us to wonder, well, why? Maybe the sheriff actually just recognized that they were terrorizing Ammon at the behest of St. Luke's lawyers and using the court system, and apparently a pretty hostile judge. And maybe it was less because, we're afraid he's going to do something and hurt us. I don't think he ever said it that way. After St. Luke's filed the petition for the writ of mandamus and prohibition, Sheriff Wunder re-engaged in discussions with the Gem County Prosecutor's Office, St. Luke's, and Holland and Hart, that's the attorney's office, to clarify the sheriff's duties. St. Luke's will withdraw the current petition for a writ of mandamus and prohibition from the Supreme Court. So they put pressure on the sheriff buckled. That's too bad. Now, this follows a lengthy lawsuit that St. Luke's filed in May of 2022 for defamation against Bundy and his campaign. Why his campaign? It's not even an issue anymore, but they're suing his campaign along with him, as well as Diego Rodriguez and his Freedom Man Press and Freedom Man Political Action Committee, as well as the People's Rights Network, over their protest of a child named Cyrus. Again, this happened to be Diego's grandson, taken by Protective Services. In fact, I'm going to add the word wrongfully, or perhaps if I want to be gentle, mistakenly taken by Protective Services. According to St. Luke's lawyer, Eric Stidham, in the release, Sheriff Wunder will sign an affidavit on Thursday agreeing to all this, and St. Luke's will withdraw its current petition to the Idaho Supreme Court. As KTVB previously reported in a letter to St. Luke's lawyers last week, Sheriff Wunder said his deputy's latest attempt to deliver paperwork dealing with the current lawsuit against Bundy became confrontational. Okay, hold up. Why did it become confrontational? Because those deputies didn't just come there to serve papers, they went snooping around on a man's private property, and that is a violation of his rights, and he was absolutely within his rights to order them off his property. Yes, he was within his rights to be righteously ticked off at them. Now, did he threaten them? Probably not. You know, these officers are trained with officer survival skills, and they're not going to stand up to being threatened. One of the deputies, by the way, to his credit, actually said, okay, we're out of here, acting as a peace officer. The other one is the one who became confrontational. So it's not all on Ammon. Deputy's ego got involved, and if it became confrontational, that's the reason why. Further, the Gem County Sheriff's Office would no longer take part in serving process to Bundy due to safety concerns. Again, the sheriff does specifically mention the process servers and deputies and being concerned for them, but those safety concerns very well could include a desire not to see Ammon or his family come to harm simply because somebody wants to get a little bit badge heavy or become, a mindless enforcer. Now, Steidham also said that St. Luke's is going to ask the judge for a default judgment. Well, why didn't you do that before? In its defamation lawsuit against Bundy, because Bundy hasn't appeared or participated in any of the legal proceedings to this point and has made it clear he won't. Now, Ammon talks about this in his video. And you can still see this for yourself. He tells you that this was a strategic decision on his part not to participate because, first of all, he says, look, I'm not going to prevail against a system that's already hopelessly stacked against me. So let them enter their default judgment, then we'll deal with the consequences afterward. St. Luke's attorney want the judge to rule in their favor and then determine damages. And oh, the damages that they're looking for. Now, again, this all stems from a days-long protest organized by Bundy outside St. Luke's in Boise over the baby taken by protective services. But now you know a little bit of the circumstances behind that. It wasn't a matter of, well, they were just trying to save this baby and Ammon was interfering. The interference that he was engaged in was interfering with the state running roughshod over a family that in no way was harming baby Cyrus. Now, the hospital also alleges that Bundy has harassed, intimidated, and defamed several members of its staff. He has called them by name. He has used his First Amendment rights to speak out against the injustice and the people who were behind that injustice. Now, if that hurts your feelings, I don't know what to tell you other than, if you're one of those people, maybe you should reconsider whether or not you are in the right or whether or not you are exceeding your rightful duties and your rightful powers as someone working for the state. But that isn't how a lot of statists think. They tend to think that anything that's not under government control is by definition out of control, and they behave accordingly. Steidham said Mr. Bundy has been in default for much of the litigation. No, he hasn't. He just simply hasn't been showing up for the proceedings because it's a civil matter, not a criminal complaint. Default means the defendant to appear timely, so all allegations in the complaint are taken as true. But St. Luke's recently moved on default judgment. Now, that's the next step. At default judgment, the court moves to the step of determining the number of damages. And in a case like ours, Steidham says where damages are not immediately ascertainable, the court must also have a hearing. At the hearing, evidence will be presented on damages. In our case, we'll also be presenting evidence on punitive damages. Oh, they want their pound of flesh. And they're willing to use their imagination to come up with how exactly can we crush this man and take from him anything that he currently has and anything he might ever have, in order to right the wrong of him calling us out on what we did that gave us negative publicity. So here's the KTVB story. And look at this headline. If I'm wrong, I need therapy. Why, there it is. Ammon admits it. He's mentally ill. I would like to offer a slightly different interpretation of this. When Ammon says, if I'm wrong, I need therapy, he is actually showing something that you do not see. In the media, you do not see it with people who work for the state, at least not often. And that is an actual bit of introspection and self-awareness, and yes, even a bit of humility. And again, if you see his latest video, you will see him asking the question, am I wrong on this? He's at least willing to consider it. Now, maybe he's asking the question rhetorically, but he's willing to ask, am I wrong for standing up for freedom under these circumstances? Was it wrong to step up and to cause a ruckus for the sake of getting this baby back safe to his family? Now, the fact that he was successful, I think, speaks volumes for the fact that it accomplished what it needed to. Was it uncomfortable? Oh, absolutely. And not just for Ammon. It was uncomfortable for everybody involved. But the bigger question is, let's walk it back to its genesis. Why did it happen in the first place? It's not because Ammon needed anything or he needed attention or he needed money, which is something St. Luke's is trying to claim. It's because the state overstepped its bounds. And in this case, it actually incorporated kind of a public-private partnership. I mean, what is it when government and private business get deeply involved in one another's comings and goings? I think fascism, I believe, is actually what that is, where there's a partnership there and, everything is covered for one another. It's an ugly situation, and it became abusive. And that's exactly why Ammon and others stood up and said, this can't be allowed to go unchallenged. Now, unfortunately, when you challenge people in power, whether it be with corporate power or legal power or the state's power, that's going to cause them some heartburn, and it has. And this is one of the reasons why they are going after him with a vengeance. So let's look at the KTVB story and how it's reported. Ammon in the interview said, when I say I don't like St. Luke's, they spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to try and destroy my life in the courts. By not participating, he says, in the lawsuit, I'm being very strategic in mitigating this lawsuit. As KTVB previously reported on Tuesday, April 18th, attorneys for St. Luke's filed a motion in the state's highest court to get the Gem County Sheriff to serve Bundy legal papers. In other words, to keep up the harassment that they've been doing now for a year. That was something that Sheriff Donnie Wonder decided was too dangerous to do anymore. That's not what he said. He said, I don't want to participate in this. He opted out of being part of this pogrom against this wayward cowboy who, for whatever reason, isn't going to stop standing up for his own rights or for other people's rights. Nice try, KTVB, but it's what you leave out that's more damning than what you actually say. Last week, Sheriff Wonder issued a press release that stated Bundy was being confrontational. That's not exactly what he said. He talked about it did turn confrontational, but part of the reason was his deputies overstepped their bounds, and the sheriff wasn't willing to risk the safety of his deputies over a civil case. Partial truth there, he said, there's no reason for somebody to get hurt over a civil case. Now, again, an exact quote would probably give us a little bit better context, but this is the spin KTVB is trying to put on it. After St. Luke's went to the Idaho Supreme Court, Sheriff Wonder had a change of heart. That is, they pressured him into changing his point of view. He wrote another letter saying he had further discussions with prosecutors, St. Luke's, and their attorneys, so he will once again abide by his statutory duties. Well, as a peace officer, part of those duties are to keep the peace, and I applaud him to the extent that he did that. It's a shame that he knuckled under, but I don't know what kind of pressure was applied to him. KTVB then informs us this stems from a days-long protest organized by Bundy outside St. Luke's in Boise over the baby taken by Child Protective Services. Now, here's the spin. Now, I gave you some context ahead of time so you can see the spin at work here. Baby Cyrus, in quotation marks, as if, this is scare quotes here, was removed from his parents after Health and Welfare determined he was malnourished and in imminent danger. How did they do that? The whole reason that supposedly they were taking him was to examine him and to see if he was in distress. He missed a doctor's appointment, or his parents missed a doctor's appointment, and the doctor immediately hit the panic button and sicked Child Protective Services on them. So there was no determination that he was malnourished. There was concern on the part of a doctor who apparently misdiagnosed him. And by the way, the doctor is human. She can make mistakes. But to get the state involved and to bring the coercion to bear, that was wrong. Now, the hospital also alleges that Bundy has harassed, intimidated, and defamed several members of its staff. Well, he certainly has called them out. And many of us would say rightly so. How else are you going to get them to stop doing something that is so harmful? The morning after the infant was hospitalized at St. Luke's in Meridian on March 12th, this is 2022, Bundy was arrested for trespassing because he refused to leave the hospital. Bundy and his People's Rights Network, he then organized several days of protests at St. Luke's in Boise, claiming the boy was medically kidnapped by doctors and Child Protective Services. They are really butthurt about this because he used the term medically kidnapped, but that is accurately describing what happened there. In an interview with KTVB, Bundy said he will not show up to the hearings or respond because he can't afford to pay attorneys to represent him and can't defend himself against their powerful lawyers. He furthered the best way to logically mitigate damages is to allow them to get a quick default judgment and then deal with the consequences. Exactly what he says in his video. Actually seems like a pretty smart way to go if you know you're up against someone with virtually unlimited resources. Now, of course, one of the attorneys for St. Luke's, Stidham, says they want to unveil Bundy's finances and expose what his protest really was. Okay, conspiracy theorist, get ready. Only this time it's pro-government conspiracy theorist. I want to make this clear. There were really significant damages financially that St. Luke's suffered because of this. We have expert report that estimates loss to St. Luke's that includes lost patient visits and disruptions at $3.5 million. And this was not cost-free. Then you look at ongoing security concerns, number of damages, and the cost could get into the tens of millions. Yes, Stidham, if you use your imagination, I'm sure you could rack those costs up to the moon and back. It still doesn't outweigh the fact that a baby was wrongfully taken from its parents under circumstances that never should have happened. And you're going after the people who called out St. Luke's for its participation in that wrongdoing. That's free speech. You may not like it, but it's free speech. And if the public sentiment turns against St. Luke's and suddenly, hey, we're not getting the donations that we used to, maybe it's time to reevaluate some of your practices, make changes if necessary. That's what decent people do. Bullies, on the other hand, double down and just, well, we'll have to try to bully a little bit harder. Bundy claims he isn't violent. Claims, of course, being that default word for we know better on the part of media, just expressing his right to free speech by protesting and legally doxing people. Now, when they say doxing, we could use some clarification. What exactly is it? By naming their name? The fact that they work at St. Luke's? I know that there were those who knew the names and addresses, and there were protests outside the homes of some of these people. And I'll grant you, that is a gray area. I know many people on the conservative side who say, that's going too far. If you're acting under state authority, though, and you're participating in stuff like this, expect to be held accountable. And that's, some people, well, that's not a call for violence? No, not at all. It's just a recognition that your actions will have consequences. And one of those consequences may be angry people holding a vigil outside your home, letting you know that you are in the wrong. Bundy says, I've never hurt or harmed anybody, ever. He's right. Yet I'm treated by the law and many others like I'm a crazy person with some weird, far-out ideals. Oh, if there was ever an understatement, that's it. They treat him as if this is a mental illness, and that's why when Ammon says, well, do I need therapy? To get my mind right? I mean, this is what the Soviets used to do, right? Well, you are accused of anti-Soviet activities. You are doubting those who are in authority over you. And frankly, all of us have been trained since we were very young to believe that we're just basically not so bright children who need to defer always to someone in authority for permission to do anything in our lives. That's not how free men and women live. Free men and women make their decisions for themselves. They recognize that government exists. It can be a good thing. It is a good thing when it's operating in the interest of protecting our inalienable or God-given rights. But when it starts to exceed that mandate, when it starts to ruthlessly micromanage every single aspect of our lives and actually starts to engage in legal plunder and medical kidnapping, among other things, somebody has got to be willing to call it out. St. Luke's asked experts to give context to Bundy's statements, and in two affidavits filed with the court a few weeks ago, it states that Bundy incites violence among his tens of thousands of People Rights Network followers when he targets anyone involved in this case online. That's their interpretation. I've never, in the time that I have known him, heard Ammon incite violence against anybody. It's absolutely contrary to what he stands for. In fact, what he's doing is he's standing against the aggression and the violence that's being incited against innocent people. Like the projection that we're seeing here on the part of not only members of the state, but these legal experts and even, members of St. Luke's. And playing the victim, as bullies often do. The defamation case has been going on for over a year, and attorneys for St. Luke's say they're more public about the suit to stand up for their employees and patients and anyone who is here's that word, conflict entrepreneur like Mr. Bundy. Well, not to use the language of the street, but if you didn't start something, there wouldn't be something. And this did not start with Ammon Bundy going out there and looking for trouble. It started with a doctor bringing the state's force to bear in a case where it absolutely was not needed, and then refusing to back down. Now look at the mess. Look at the amount of money that's being spent. Gosh, St. Luke's, just in what they're spending on legal fees is probably their stockholders got to be going, is this really worth it? Is it really worth, going after it? And interestingly enough, Ammon has also put out a video in the last few days saying, look, come and take everything that I own materially. If you want to compel me to, if you're going to sue me for my coat, I'll give you my cloak. You want to compel me to walk a mile? I'll walk 2 miles with you. Take everything from me, but leave me in peace. What do you bet they're going to do it? I don't think they will. I think their goal is we've got to discredit him. We've got to jail him. We've got to punish this guy. If they could drive him to suicide, that would probably be best for them, but they'd settle for some kind of ginned up confrontation and portraying him as dangerous so that we get law enforcement, to take care of him for us. And yes, there are people openly lusting for this kind of thing online. How sick and twisted is that? All right, I'm going to step off the soapbox for that. From our I Told You So department, thank you, Senator Brian Lenny, for showing the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare confirms conservatives were spot on for voting down the absurd Medicaid budget bill last month when the legislature was in session. The biggest budget bill Idaho has ever seen. It passed by 1 vote. To get some context on this, Nicholas Kleinworth with the Idaho Freedom Foundation has an excellent article at idahofreedom.org about how lawmakers have wasted $282 million in taxpayer funds on Medicaid ineligibles cut from the program. Just a couple of quick excerpts. 3 weeks after lawmakers voted to remove just a fraction of ineligible beneficiaries from the program, new data reveals that legislators over-budgeted for Medicaid by an estimated $282 million. This means that conservative lawmakers and Idaho Freedom Foundation analysts were correct in their assessment that more cuts could have been made despite opposition from the leftist establishment. The Idaho Department of Health and Welfare estimates there are nearly 154,000 on the rolls whose eligibility is unknown. For perspective, the department estimates that the population of Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, participants is 450,000. That means nearly 1 in 5 Idahoans are on Medicaid, with 1 in 3 of those participants potentially ineligible for the benefits they receive. As of this writing, Idaho Department of Health and Welfare redetermined the eligibility of 39,869 beneficiaries. Of this group, the department removed 25,490 people who were verified to be ineligible to participate in the program. This constitutes an ineligibility rate of 64%, meaning that even conservatives underestimated the amount of overspending. If not for the persistence from conservative lawmakers and research from the Idaho Freedom Foundation to draw attention to this issue, Idahoans would have overpaid for Medicaid by another $152 million. And while this could be considered a success, Idahoans are still overpaying for the program by hundreds of millions of dollars when it did not have to be that way. Again, you can get more information at idahofreedom.org. Just know there are people who are pushing back against government overspending, against government overreach, against outright government tyranny in some cases. And you are being told by those blow-dried spinmeisters that this is somehow a mental problem on their part. How dare they do this? Why, it's just, it's unless they embrace all the leftist talking points, somehow they've got some kind of a mental condition. Well, they can label it whatever they want. Just know that they're in good company with their Soviet counterparts, who likewise labeled anyone who disagreed with party doctrine and dogma as being somehow mentally out of tune and had to be sent to re-education camps. Now, are we headed for re-education camps? I don't know. Sometimes I wonder. But the bottom line is, there are people who are trying to stand up for your freedom. You are being trained, and I'm being trained, that we must hate these people. We must fear them. They are dangerous, and they're going to ruin everything for everybody. My advice is, if you want to, watch the media. Let them tell you what they think. But if you really want to know what's going on, you're going to have to buck up and go to the source. That means you may have to think outside that little statist box, that 3x5 index card of approved opinion that you're allowed to consider. You might be surprised what you learn. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.